Welcome to Recovery Corner, where the many pathways of recovery intersect. This is a space where you will hear personal stories of triumph in recovery, gain insights into various recovery-oriented systems, and learn how leaders across the country are building recovery-ready communities. The Recovery Corner podcast does not provide clinical advice.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Young People in Recovery's YouTube channel. My name is Saraiha Sampson, and as a woman of color, a former foster care child, and the daughter of people in recovery, I have a lot of thoughts about how we can make recovery more accessible to everyone. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about systemic racism in recovery and discuss some of the long-term generational effects that can come from lack of affordable access to recovery services. Contrary to public belief, racism isn't always an intentional choice, nor is it always the fault of an individual. More often, racism is a systemic and cultural problem that seeps into the very fabric of society. So what does systemic racism even mean, though? The word gets thrown around so much that I think it can kind of, muddle the interpretations, right? But I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. Systemic racism is a representation of prejudice that's aggressively embedded throughout our systems, our policies, our practices, our beliefs, and so on and so forth. So instead of picturing just a bunch of people all doing racist things, systemic racism is more like thinking about a bigger picture, right? It's usually exploring racist policies and structures in huge, complex organizations like the healthcare system or the school system or the criminal justice system, or even the political system as a whole, right? For visual representation, some researchers have likened systemic racism to an iceberg where, the more blatant and overt manifestations of racism, things like hate crimes or, discrimination at businesses, that kind of thing, those things rise to the top of the iceberg. So we see them right away, right? But under the surface, there's larger systemic issues like housing inequality, healthcare inequality, predatory financial practices, and barriers to education that are just under the surface, right? These examples are sometimes so ingrained into a society that oftentimes they're considered to be the very natural order of things, and they tend to get overlooked when we're talking about issues. Sometimes interpersonal racism, those things that we see all the time, sometimes it's so obvious and it's so uncomfortable and so cringy that it's almost viral. And that makes it really easy to focus on. But really, it's only one symptom of a much larger, much deeper conflict. So in America, I think people are really quick to wave off racism by claiming it's all in the past or that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. But that's really only true if those kind of things don't happen to you. If you don't have to live with the long-standing consequences of systemic racism every single day, then yeah, if to you it probably seems like it's in the past, right? But it's just not. While the civil rights movement of the 1960s made some really awesome strides when it comes to rectifying these wrongs, poor enforcement of anti-discrimination laws really made those changes largely mute. The socioeconomic and health consequences persist still because of the unjust systems that operate in our nation and the deeply rooted racial hierarchy that centers those same structures on whiteness. Whether or not the undercurrent of white supremacy that sits at the heart of American society is intentional or not doesn't even matter. What matters is that it's there, it's bubbling away unchecked and puppeteering our whole society towards greater inequality. Systemic racism is a threat to true equality and serves to ensure that people of color live within the confines of chronic disadvantage. Plus, once it's set in place, systemic racism is mostly cyclical and self-perpetuating. This means that it can become so ingrained into a society that it almost becomes part of the society, So let's talk about the African American community specifically. Policies like redlining, predatory lending practices, and discrimination have established fairly concrete borders between neighborhoods that are and are not realistic options for Black families to live in. Because of this, African Americans largely keep to urban areas with higher population densities and lower property taxes. This, in turn, lessens the quality of public education, of libraries, hospitals, law enforcement agencies, infrastructure, and even the quality of the internet. These disadvantages mean that Black Americans are less likely to pursue higher education. They're less likely to own a home, to start a business, and more. All of the things that contribute to upward mobility in a Western society. What's more, these struggles and racist practices have become a piece of African American culture. Now we don't just live in the ghetto because we have to. Now we live there just because that's where home is. We've become so removed from the cause of our suffering that we've begun to accept it as the rightful and natural order of things. It's just how it is, right? We don't even think about why it is anymore. And that's what systemic racism does. That's what makes it so dangerous. So, with the topic defined, I think it's important to take a poignant look at the historical roots of systemic racism, specifically as it relates to the recovery and substance use disorder community. Although there hasn't been a whole ton of research yet into the racial disparities in the recovery community, current research does suggest that there are several relevant factors that contribute to these inequalities. First, deeply ingrained institutional biases, which heavily influence the experience of all citizens. Second, the stress caused by living under racist systems can make a substance use disorder worse and long-term recovery harder to achieve. And lastly, the institutional biases that influence how people, especially medical practitioners, behave towards people of color. Institutional biases have very hefty sway over how we, the public, live our lives. We've seen examples of this numerous times, but there are several instances specific to substance use disorder. The framework of early US drug policy, was overtly racist and discriminatory. For example, the Harrison Act of 1914 introduced a strict registration requirement for anyone who manufactured, dispensed, or distributed any products derived from coca or opium. While this may seem upfront like a common sense law, in reality, the effects were incredibly detrimental and helped to solidify the shifting public opinion that addiction was more of an issue of deviance than it was disease. Following years of tightening drug policy and heightening enforcement, then President Richard Nixon coined the term the war on drugs. Nixon was referring to a slurry of policies that would increase the power of the Drug Enforcement Agency, or the DEA, and escalate the consequences for disobedience. Supposedly, the war on drugs was started in response to the devastating effects that the opioid and crack epidemics were having on the Black community. But history reveals another motive. During this period, the size and presence of the federal drug control agencies increased dramatically and wielded measures like mandatory minimum sentencing laws and no-knock search warrants to intimidate, imprison, and discriminate against communities of color. After Nixon, presidents aligned with both parties focused heavily on spreading those harmful policies and the merits they promoted. The longstanding effects of these policies are still as visible today as they were when they were introduced. As of 2017, for example, Black Americans only accounted for 12% of the total population, but made up for a full 30% of the incarcerated population. Despite research exhibiting that both white and non-white people use drugs at similar rates. Existing in modern America as a person of color also comes with stresses all on its own. For decades, stress has been considered an important contributor to the development of a substance use disorder, and where people of color are concerned, additional stress can come just from existing as a non-white person. On top of the stress that can accumulate from experiencing regular microaggressions or feeling othered, people of color can also endure increased stress due to the effects of structural factors like housing unaffordability, food insecurity, or lack of affordable health care. The long-term psychological effects of living in a resource-poor area can have substantial implications for the individual and also serves to perpetuate a cycle of inequality within future generations. Studies have shown that both generational trauma and current psychological distress can contribute to the development of a substance use disorder, which means that people of color are put at an unfair disadvantage and an increased risk. Lastly, the third contributing factor we're going to examine are biases. Of course, Everyone has implicit biases or, subconscious inclinations that, despite being unintentional, affect how we view or behave around other types of people. And healthcare providers aren't any different. However, research has shown that these subconscious opinions do influence how clinicians go about their healthcare decision making. For example, studies have proven that clinicians are more likely to underrate the pain that Black patients are feeling, even going so far as to believe that Black people aren't as sensitive to pain, which is the belief that goes back to the racist practices of early physicians who regularly treated or experimented on Black slaves without anesthesia. In fact, a 2016 study found that about half of all medical students in the United States still believe this to be true, despite there being only evidence to the contrary. Imagine how this kind of bias might influence a patient's experience. Imagine being a Black child in excruciating pain and being sent away from the ER with no medical intervention or substantial pain relief. These kind of things happen all the time. These kind of biases may help to explain why people of color are often less likely to be prescribed buprenorphine, which can be taken at home to treat their opioid use disorder, and are more commonly offered methadone, which is required to be picked up daily from a clinic. In contrast, studies have shown that white people are more likely to be prescribed buprenorphine for their opioid use disorder right away. In 2020, it was estimated that over 41 million Americans had a substance use disorder, but only 2.7 million received any kind of treatment for it. Plus, SAMHSA reported that while Black Americans only received treatment 18.6% of the time, the percentage for white Americans measured 23.5%. Forces like systemic racism have coalesced into an enormous imbalance of wealth and power, which seeps into every aspect of our society. Additionally, consequences of these conditions mean that BIPOC communities have been made more vulnerable to disease, stress, environmental discrimination, and unhealthy habits that contribute to the development of a substance use disorder. Thus, in order to actually address any of these massive systemic problems, we have to first learn to recognize the economic and sociopolitical forces that impact our lives on a day-to-day basis. After all, if we don't understand a corrupt system or recognize a corrupt system, then how are we supposed to change it? So what can we do as a recovery support network, as a community of individuals who care about these issues? What can be done to change things? Well, at the local level, partnering with community organizations and leaders of color are vital to both increasing our understanding of the needs of people of color in recovery and inspiring people to action. Many non-white people hold generational trauma, which contribute to their substance use disorder diagnosis. Systemic wrongs, both past and present, like slavery, mass incarceration, police brutality, high unemployment, and community violence can have a massive impact on a person's upbringing and development. Thus, substance use disorder clinicians working with people of color should be trauma specialists who are prepared to address issues that may fly under the radar of typical white-focused intervention and treatment methods. Lastly, advocacy is one of the most liberating forces society has to offer. Not only does it offer a way for the public to express what issues are and aren't important to us, but it also generates discussion, expands understanding, and of course, can be a real driving force between massive institutional changes. We as a recovery community need to be advocating for equal access to treatment, reparations for the war on drugs, and responsible drug policy changes which focus on treatment instead of punishment. We can also advocate for policies that would mitigate the effects of systemic racism and make recovery more accessible, like increasing public transportation budgets so people can get to treatment, investing in universal pre-K, especially for single parents, and increasing the minimum wage so that people can afford healthcare. If one isn't able to get to treatment or find someone to care for their child during treatment or afford treatment whatsoever, they aren't going to get treatment. Thus, the cycle continues. So, in closing, systemic racism is a real problem that affects real people in our communities. We all know somebody who has been affected by substance use disorder one way or another. Our mothers, our brothers, our cousins, our friends, somebody. This is the first video in a series that'll dive deeper into some of these inequalities and some of these topics. So if that's something that interests you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content. For more information on substance use disorder resources and recovery, or to get involved, please visit youngpeopleinrecovery.org.